Excel pivot tables and graphing for auditors. My name is Jim Kaplan, founder of AuditNet, and with us today is my colleague and friend Rich Lanza, an ACL, Excel, and audit software expert. This webinar represents a collaboration between AuditNet and AuditSoftware.net in delivering training series focusing on audit software. We're glad you could join us. I'll be moderating today's webinar. A little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm the founder of AuditNet with a background as a Chief Audit Executive, Internet for Auditors pioneer, and an auditor who believes and promotes the use of technology for audit. The next slide provides some information about AuditNet. I won't read that. Before we proceed to today's material and introducing our presenter, Rich Lanza, I'd like to go through a few important housekeeping points. The webinar is being recorded, so please pay attention to the information that we sent out in the slides this morning. You will be provided with a link to the recording. It usually takes us about 5 to 7 days to get that up. It will be sent via email, and also because today's webinar qualifies for NASBA CPE. NASBA rules require us to ask polling questions during the webinar, and the CPE certificates will be sent via email to those who answer all the polling questions. You must answer all the polling questions in order to receive the CPE for today. The CPE certificates and link to the recording will be sent to the email address you registered with GoToWebinar. We're not responsible for delivery problems due to spam filters, attachment restrictions, or other controls in place for your email client. So please make sure that you can receive email from us. You may have to check your spam folder to see if the certificate and the link went there. You can submit questions via the chat box on your screen. We'll answer them during or at the conclusion. And just to let you know, we do have close to 200 people registered for today, so we may get a lot of questions, and please be patient. We'll try to get to all the questions that we can. If not, we will follow up with an email. After the webinar is over, you will have an opportunity to provide feedback. Please complete the feedback questionnaire to help us continuously improve our webinars. If GoToWebinar for some reason stops working, you may need to close and restart. You can always dial in and listen and follow along with the handout. The next screen provides some information in regards to disclaimers. You can take a moment to read the disclaimers. They were sent out in the slides this morning. And at this point, I'd like to afford Rich maximum amount of time for today's webinar. So please, Rich, take it from here.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Jim. And thanks, everyone, for coming today. I have a lot of experience in ACL, Excel, active data for Excel. Try to even show that a little bit today if we can on how it might relate to pivot tables and a variety of other products, and done so for many years. But I continue to go back to Excel, and I think it's why we have such a popular attendance today, because it is something of a topic that everyone can use and use it on a daily basis, whereas other products you might utilize more so on a weekly basis or something like that. So I've written a lot. You can learn more about me at richlanza.com and auditsoftwarevideos.com as well. Getting into today's session, and not wanting to take really anything away from today's session, in that we want to show a lot of examples today. That's sort of my goal. And therefore, and also open it up for questions and see what comes in, so that I could try to kind of show things as we go. For the most part, what I've found is that the basic pivot tables most people can do, and what I find also is we'll try to not only do some of the basics for people that have never made a pivot table before, but also then get into more advanced things. And one thing I like is to code data, as I'll show you, and then stratify it as an example. But you can code data in lots of different ways. I want to show you how to run a lot of specific audit tests so that you can actually relate this, instead of this just being an Excel course on, summarizing widgets and other things that you might see in a more generic Excel training. I will do my best to make it more audit specific, and we will as we go through that, talk about mostly the accounts payable and general ledger areas. because they're the most popular, we find as we go around and survey. Those seem to be the two areas that most people, will focus on first. We'll be using a lot of graphing as well as utilizing a named range that will kind of recalculate itself as you add data to it. And I'll be even doing that more on the fly today, as you'll see. We will be doing this live. As we go through this, we'll talk through more of the advanced things like name ranges and things like that, where I will be sure to miss a semicolon or something in doing that. What we will also do is give you the data files after the class. You'll have an access to videos. I saw one question come in about where do we get a copy of this after the seminar. And just so you know that the videos will be a link that you'll have, and it'll probably be a YouTube link, but it'll be something that will be on auditsoftwarevideos.com. And generally what we do is we take it down after about 6 months of time, and it goes away. But the data files will also be available there, so like almost everything I go through today you'll have. There's like one or two things that's a bit proprietary, but everything else you'll have, and you'll be able to do the whole course for sure. So a lot here to do. Wanted to go through the whole day with you. If you have any questions as you're going through this, and based on the learning objectives or anything, feel free to kind of jump in. But with that said, let's kind of get to the basics of pivot tables. You probably will see that the slides today are a bit light, and for the most part, I tend to almost not go through some of them. But with that said, I think the earlier parts of this, I do want to go through the slides and kind of show you, some of the more basic concepts. But as we get on into the day, or a couple hours here, we'll go more to the examples. So the query viewpoints are something that a pivot table works off of, and I kind of like to think of it more as almost like a journalistic question of who, what, when, where, and why. So you can look at any sort of data set that you're looking at, general ledger, accounts payable, payroll, T&E, whatever, and kind of ask these who, what, when, where, why questions, and then put reports to those questions. I think there's a couple of things that you do when you're doing this. I think one is you're querying data where you're asking a lot of questions. We will be doing that a bit today, and a question might be, for example, I want to align a vendor file to the employee file, and I want to look for ones that match up. It's a question, who are the vendors that also show up on the employee list would be a query that's like in the who category. But what we're really doing today is talking about the data mining aspects and more or less just kind of summarizing data and then looking at it from that perspective. So, when you look at this whole, chart, think of the questions. We'll keep kind of repeating them over and over. But remember that we're doing more of a data mining exercise than a query exercise where you're asking specific questions. A couple of slides here I'm just going to quickly go through. Getting started, I generally would note that the pivot toolbar that's added there is really useful, and that's kind of something. It's a ribbon, you'll see in a second as you insert kind of a pivot table from the insert menu. It will kind of look at all your data and map it. But what I really like is it then kind of adds to Excel this pivot table tools section or ribbon. And at that point, you have the ability to go to options on your pivot tables or design. And the options are above and the design is below in those images that you're seeing there. But what's really nice is that, almost everything that you can do with a pivot table is now within these two ribbons, and it's very easy for you to kind of get to stuff. So if you do forget where something is, there are some nuances of Excel where you have to kind of click on a certain spot and then the ribbon bar comes up. But even that, for example, like group field, you could probably see in the slide here is not grayed out, or it is grayed out, but it's not kind of something you can click on. And as you click on the right field in your Excel pivot table, it will become something you can click on. We will obviously be using that. And then in changing some of the number formats, this is sort of a key thing. There's a few ways to do it. I mean, you can do it from the ribbon. And apologize. So you can do it from the ribbon, and generally you could go to field settings, which is in the options menu. So you go way to the left here, and it says like active field. It's trying to kind of put you in the right direction for the most part as it lays out the ribbon. But you can also right-click on a field, and that allows this to come up, and you can change a lot. What's really nice is you could set like the pivot table to look for maximums or minimums or averages and products, etc. You could various things there. We'll show all of that. What I really like is the pivot chart because once you've summarized your data and it's all laid out, you just click pivot chart and it makes a nice graph. And that graph is dynamic, so as you're changing your pivot table, it changes the graph. If you filter things out, if you add things in, etc. So it's really a nice addition to it as well. We'll just kind of lastly note here, the grouping, I was talking about that before. The field that you kind of want to click on is if you're grouping on check date, you want to kind of click on that, right-click on that field and hit the group button or vendor number. You do the same. So let me jump into Excel now, so hold on one second. And in looking at this file here, this is a accounts payable file, and we're going to use this file, this data file, a lot today. We're also going to use a general ledger data file quite a bit as well. The file itself generally has to be rows and columns. You can't have a file where you have something where you have data over here and over here and over here and it's all over the place. You really have to have your data laid out into more of a column or rows and columns format. With that, you can go to your Insert button and click on Pivot Table. Again, I would say out to the right, even things like this may get picked up but may not. If you want, what I usually do is insert a couple of columns there, and it normally doesn't pick it up. I kind of forgot that was out there, but we're going to talk about that later. Anyway, in inserting the pivot table, it lines up to column O, and that looks about right. Okay, and then we hit the OK button. Now what that does is it creates the pivot table worksheet. You had an option to put the pivot table in the same sheet as the data, but I don't ever really do that. I mean, there probably was a time I've done it once, but for the most part, I find that it almost can have a conflicting nature with the data that you're working with. Anyway, keep it to another sheet is probably my best example. If you click, excuse me, if you click anywhere in the data itself, you can go to Pivot Table Tools. And like I said, you have an ability to kind of do things with the pivot table now that you're on the pivot table. If you click off the pivot table, it goes away. Click on the pivot table, it comes back. Okay, so now that we have some of the basics of sort of creating a pivot table, what you could do is to add, just as a starting point, check date. And what we want to do here is just kind of get sort of a daily analysis of the accounts payable data. And then what I'll do is I'll drag the invoice amount to the values. And if you can see down here on the bottom of the screen here, we have kind of check date on the left and some of the sum of the invoice amount on the right. If for some reason, I don't know why this would happen, but if like check date's in the columns, and you want it in the rows, you can just drag it over to the rows and it will, kind of readjust the pivot table accordingly. Okay, some of the other things that we talked about grouping, so I just want to hit on this while I'm on my kind of check date field. If I click on the field that I want to group on, so either I think even the check date up here or the actual data down here, I normally click on the data itself. You can click on group field, and this works with dates. It generally, gosh, I only really use it for dates, but there's probably other ways of using it. You can then click on month and year, and it creates a nice little summary. I mean, this obviously is from almost like a fiscal year, June to June of 10 to 11, a little bit old there. But then to change the amounts here, see, these amounts look a little cryptic. Now, one way to do it is to highlight the data, just kind of hit this button, and it will kind of readjust your data. But then, if I ever let's say if I wanted to ungroup my data, I can click in the pivot table, go to Pivot Table Tools, and click on Ungroup. And in that case, my formatting goes away. So if you want to, I find to Control Z and Control Z and Control Y will work. So you can, I just Controlled Z'd to get back to where we were. Now, in order to truly kind of set the format here, the best way to do it is to click on the data field. But I generally do it over here, and I click on the right, on the drop-down button in this field, and click on Value Field Settings, and then do Number Format. Change it to number. You could use commas. You could get rid of decimal places, if you will, and end up with a much more nicely formatted set of data. Now that we have this, and it's nicely kind of laid out for us, we could even pivot chart this data. So just going to the next concept that we talked about, if you click anywhere in the pivot table and click on Pivot Chart, you have a variety of options here. This one looks pretty good. I mean, this isn't so bad. Let's take that one's a little crazy. One thing we could do, so let's kind of take a look at this. So here's a chart. Again, just because of pivot tables and how they expand and contract, it generally doesn't have that much of an effect on this file, but it may kind of adjust it. I tend to right-click my pivot charts or any chart that I create and move that chart to its own worksheet. So I'll call it Pivot Sample with CH at the end for chart. And now we have a pivot table, and it's graphically represented. What I could then do is kind of bring the years. If I can do this, let me just kind of bring the years over into the columns, and let's go back to that pivot chart. So I just grabbed the years field and pulled it over there. And notice now, because I selected a 3D type chart, so if you select anywhere in the chart, pivot chart tools come up, and you can select either design, pivot chart tools design, click chart type. Notice I'm on the 3D column format, and this gives you a bit of a year over year. Unfortunately, we only have 1 month that's year over year, but at least you could kind of see how that would work. And if you had multiple years, 10, 11, 12, etc., you could kind of see that graphically represented in a 3D kind of format. So kind of remember, I think remember that from the perspective of rows and columns and the 3D charting, because I think that 3D charting has a nice way of kind of showing a lot of data in a very small space, and also allow you to relate things, whereas, for example, if we kind of pull back to the years down here, you'll notice here it's kind of hard to relate the June here to the June there, because they're so far apart, literally, at the ends of the chart here, that's something where the pivot table can help that 3D chart can really help to make it make a lot more sense to you. Okay, so now we've gone through the basics, and what I wanted to do is just kind of get our first polling question going, just to launch these. And the polling question is, where do you change the value formats in a pivot table? Is it in the grouping section, in the value field setting section, in the pivot chart, or the active field format? So grouping, value field setting, pivot chart, active field format. For the most part, I know we've answered the questions so far online. This is a great time to ask questions. I take a little bit of a break and in talking. We keep these open for about a minute, minute and a half, unless there's questions, of course. So we do ask that you fill it out, especially if you want CPE credit, because we do kind of track on who clicked to kind of track the CPE credit. And so just noting that as well. I think Jim mentioned this, but if there is an issue, I believe you can email the answers as well if you're having trouble like with an iPad or something like that, but it really should be like as the course is happening if you can. So one question came in, and I will get to this just looking at things by quarter. So yes, we can do that, absolutely, and I'll show you that as well. I will also note, I wanted to get through some of the basics so far. We will be kind of doing a more complex basic one with the stratification next. But then I like to get into the specific accounts payable and general ledger tests, because I do find that's where you can, really get a lot of, kind of a much better idea of how these tools work in a practical setting. So we'll definitely spend some time there. All right, almost everyone's voted, so let me close this poll and share that with everyone. And value field settings is the correct answer, as you can see that. So let me hide that poll. And again, value field settings was something you can get in more of the drop-down menu format, which is over here, or it's up in the pivot table tools section as well, over here in the field settings. Okay, one question came in. Can you do it by quarter? Yes, you can right-click in the data, click on Group, and select the quarter. I could get rid of month, I mean, in that case, and just have quarters, etc. And then now this is a different representation of the data, and actually, again, does a great job of kind of showing where some of the real activity is in that company. Okay, so one of the things I also wanted to show you is in the payables data, what I like to do is a lot of coding of the data. So one of what we'll do now is create a lot of pivot tables based on these code fields. And you could do a lot here. I'm talking about accounts payable, but if you're coding revenue accounts, if you're looking at general ledger, sorry, just looking at the questions there quickly to make sure I'm not missing something. Anyway, back to the data here. What we can do is quite a bit of analysis on these coded fields. If it is a general ledger, you could code all the different account types, where it kind of flows to the financial statements. In this case, we're taking a look at the day of the week. The Benford law digits of 1, 2, and 3. If anyone knows about Benford's law, that's something that it's something nice to kind of summarize on those fields. And what I will do is we may as well actually definitely go through that as well as we're analyzing the data today and this morning. But also I have this stratification over on the right-hand side, and I'm not going to go to my slide, but this is where I kind of explain two different types of the stratification. And but without going to the slide, let me just kind of show it to you here. This is a pretty complex, way of handling the stratification approach. This is something, what we're doing is we're kind of laying out in an if statement, but then also kind of adding to that, we're doing so in more of like an and type sequence by kind of adding them all together. I'm not going to suggest this approach. I mean, I have it here. If I think it's useful, possibly, if you have something of, various different code fields that are maybe within certain account ranges or something. But I got to tell you, the second version, this was sort of the old way of doing it. The second version that Charlie Walker at a company called Topcats, who produces a very similar add-in to Excel like Active Data, came up with this great approach, and he looked at my video and said, there's a better way. What you can do is a VLOOKUP, and there's a way of creating a field for this. Now, this works with a lot of things, like you could have account number ranges for, say, general ledger account numbers. You could have product number ranges, so if it's a certain inventory products, 00001 to 0000 whatever, 10,000 is part of a certain type of a product group, and then 10,001 onward would be the next product group type. These are ways to kind of use VLOOKUP, but you have to do it in a different kind of way. Most VLOOKUPs work in more of a very direct way, like it's a yes or no answer. It either equals, I either have a field like RL and have a name table over here where RL equals Rich Lanza, and it's very direct. If it doesn't match, it puts NA, basically saying it doesn't work. But the way he did the stratification, which I really liked, was he used the true button. So let's kind of take a look at this VLOOKUP, and you can do so by clicking the FX button on that top end there. What that does is it's looking up the invoice amount field, which is B2, so you can see that. It's then going through this table array, which I can click on this to show it to you. It should be, I'm sorry, it should be these over here, R4, I think, to S8. Hit the enter button. In this case, because of the way I built it, I want to actually put the F4, I want to click my F4 button, or put those, put those dollar signs in there. So the F4 button allows you to very quickly align that for you. And then what I want to do is set up a column index of 2. Now, the reason, now with I've kind of set this up of R4 to S8 and column index 2. What the VLOOKUP is going to do is it's going to look at this section of data here, and it will look at column 2 based on what's in column 1. And because of the way I've set up the dollar signs, it actually fixes it to that range. So it won't move around as you move the actual function around. So, but here's the interesting thing. Then I add the true button here. Now when true is there, things have to be sorted in ascending order. So find the closest match, sorted in ascending order, which we've done here. And then we basically say, we put true. And what it'll do is it'll find the closest match. What I generally find, let me just put it here, is it will work off of the lowest end of the match and then kind of work its way up. And then when you get to, so this is up to 100, sorry, over here, we have up to 100. And up to 100 would be the 0.01. And then a 0 and would be 0. And I don't know why I do this, but I put this negative 50,000 in there. I think I can take this out. See, I always feel like I have to have that in there. Yeah, see, it kind of proves my point. I felt like I didn't need it, but it seems as though you have to have something below it. And I feel like, feel free to, make this almost as big as you'd like because it, as a negative number, but I always feel like you have to have that negative there first. Okay, that sets it up. Then what it does is we have the 0, and I have 0 and under as well. Then we have the 0.01, which means everything up to 1 cent, which will basically, that's when it's starting out, and it'll go up to $100. The 100 is where, again, it'll kind of start at that 100 and then go to 1,000. And then at the 1,000 mark, it's basically starting and then going over that 1,000 mark. What I find is that the new format here of this VLOOKUP allows me to very quickly copy that downward. And as you have, say, B3 here, B4, this is now copying that formula down, whereas the S or R4 to S8 kind of stays in more of a set fashion. So a little bit hard to kind of set up, I think, the first time. But once it's set up, it is something that's pretty easily set up to any sort of ranges of product numbers, account numbers, etc. Okay, I talk about the coding and really kind of spend some time in this because I really like to make the point that data that you get can be summarized in so many other different, better ways. By setting up that range, again, we'll talk later towards the end about how to set up in a dynamic nature. Now, the dynamic nature is much more of a much harder setup, if you will. So I want to talk about that later. But for now, it seems to have gotten the right data. And what I can do is first off, let's summarize on that day of week. Now, notice how it threw that into the sum category. I want to drag that over to rows. And then in the day of week, I can bring that over again and right-click on this field, value field settings. Instead of sum, I can click on count. And that allows me to count up the number of items that happened in each day of the week. And then I can select amount, invoice amount, drag that down, and that's now the sum of the invoice amount. And now you can kind of see that sum there as well. Day of week works off of, I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between these two. The day of the week is working, off of the weekday function, and the weekday is pointed at that date field. Sorry about that. Okay, then the way the days work is 1 is a Sunday, and 7 is a Saturday. So 2 to 6 is Monday to Friday, and I don't know. I mean, we could look at this data further, but for the most part, I just want to show you how this is working. Then the other one is Benford Law. Benford Law is that setup where we're taking a look at the digits of numbers, the first digit, second digit, third digit, and I'm using the left function for this. Now, just in that same pivot table, if we look at this and say, okay, we're done with that, let's move on to kind of the next data mining question. I can click on Pivot 1, and I actually, what I'll do is, just to set this up properly, I'm going to bring the invoice amount in here twice, and I'm going to change the value field settings to count, and I'm also going to change the number format to something much, easier to look at. And I'm going to do that for the sum as well, real quickly here. Okay, good enough. So this is giving us a perspective of how many items show up in, say, the first digit, well, in this case, first digit, sorry. And then what we can do is we can drag into this the first 2 digits and take a look. These are some negatives, which is interesting. But then we get into the ones themselves and doing a summary of each one of those digits. Now, as you can see here in my data, there's a little uncleanliness, so you may want to clean that up in your data itself and looking at the field and or changing the actual amount field itself. But again, just trying to kind of quickly show you how these are working. The next one would be the Benford 3, so you can drag that in there as well, and then it kind of even brings it down to, say, that level as well, so that you're looking at all 3 levels. Going back to just kind of Benford 1 for a second, what you can do is go out to the web. I won't do it right now, but just in the interest of time, but you can go out and look up Wikipedia, and the Benford Law percentages are kind of set out there. Now, I may have this already in here, and I do. So I set up a Benford nums sheet before. These are the ones that you'll end up getting in the data. And what you'll notice here is I've already copied that into here. So you can actually do a relationship of these two. This is a great time to kind of bring up this point of how data that is in a pivot table itself is not the easiest to work with from a formula point of view. I mean, there are ways to do it, but it's almost easier at times to copy that data out and paste it, and you could either highlight the data. Another way of doing is you can do Control-Shift and your number 8 key, so Control-Shift-8, and copy that data. And generally what I do is I do a paste values, and that'll kind of bring the values of that data in. And then you can kind of copy over your Benford Law to this, and you could look at differentials between your percentages and Benford Law percentages. And this can be done generally for this first digit of numbers, so wanted to show you how to do that because I know some people like to take a look at that. I'm going to talk later about Benford amounts, so that'll be done when we talk about some accounts payable data in more of a, how do we audit accounts payable data, but just noting that for now. Going back to the payables data, we spent a lot of time on this, and we built this stratification. So ultimately I wanted to kind of get to the stratification. And what I like to do is also pivot table. Let me go over to that sheet that I keep kind of playing with here. And what we'll do is we'll get rid of Benford 1. Notice my invoice amounts are all still kind of there. Which is nice, and then I can put in the strata. But now, because I do have this years set in there, I can just drag that into the values. And what that does is it gives you kind of an analysis of your spend and your count by stratification. And I like to look at this. I even, to be honest with you, like to look at this by month and year. So we'll look at that in a second. But just looking at this or even pivot charting this can be a very useful way of taking a look at your data. This is kind of showing 2 things. I believe you can get to a combo graph, and I am, probably not going to play with this too much right now, just in the interest of time. But I do find the, for the most part, the stratification was probably best put to be, now that I think about it, into the columns, because it is like a fixed number, and it's a pretty, usually it's only like 5 or 6 stratification that you have. Now that you have that, what we can do is kind of drag in, say, the check date, like we had before. Whoops, where are you there? Drag that into the rows. We have it grouped at quarters right now, so I'm going to, ungroup that, and then regroup that, but now do it in month and year format. And now we have it in more of this type of format. I'm going to try to just do the sum, because I'm just kind of curious how this would look. This is sample data, but I believe we might even have, nope, that was based on this pivot sample. Let me create the pivot chart here. So off of this one here, we click on Pivot Table Tools, hit Pivot Chart, and in this case, this would be fine. And what you can do is get an analysis by month of the variety of stratification that you have. Let me just move that chart. I like to move them to their own. They're a little bit easier to read as well, and be able to give you a perspective. Could also do that 3D version that we talked about as well before, where each one of these would be a 3D. I think this will allow me. Let me go to Pivot Chart Tools, Design, change chart type to that. And that gives you a different, perspective as well. And I tend to like the 3D chart if I haven't said that enough today. Okay. So let me go back to the payables data itself. And I think actually at this time, this would be a good time to I see some questions coming in, some thoughts going in, but also it's a good point to kind of break for the next polling question, which I've just launched. And that is, should be which function improves the ease of calculating a stratification report? Is it offset, COUNTIF, SUMIF, or VLOOKUP? Okay, so many of you have voted while you're doing your polling question. I'm seeing a comment here. Hold on one second. So just noting here, we will go over, we did take a look at the field section by quarter. We will go over to make sure that the pivot table range is automatically set. We're going to use an offset for that one. Can pivot tables be used to auditing dormant accounts? I have to say I'm not an absolute pro on that, but I would say to look for activity. I mean, if you could actually get activity, say for a vendor table, and summarize, this is for accounts payable and not so much for bank dormant accounts, so I'm not sure which one, but with that said, if it was a vendor one, you would look at the activity. If it's a bank one, you would look at the activity as well, summarize it by vendor, and then relate that to the vendor master file and say, in the last 2 years we had this much activity related to the vendor master file now. You relate it, and then after that relationship is done, which we're not so much doing today, this is pivot tables. The relationship is something that you can do using VLOOKUP or other products, usually like ACL or IDEA. But once that relationship is done, then you can look for the unmatched items, the ones that don't match your activity. So just noting that. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm just looking at this next question here. Just bear with me in 1 second. It's just a long one here. And just a note, yeah, we are jamming a lot of information into today's session. So as we go through it, there will be a video. You can watch it for at least 6 months. We do have other videos you could watch as well to kind of bolster up on these techniques as well. And we will be pointing to you all to that. I totally agree with you. I think it's something where what I'm doing, even as a professional in this field, is I go back to my own videos and watch them at times for very complex concepts or ones I always forget, and it brings it all back, but it's like I need that little bit of bring it all back reminder. Okay, thanks for all the questions. I will kind of take this last one here, and I think it's more of a comment to me, so I just have to read it. Hold on one second. Okay, great. Yeah, I think it's a question with regards to pivot charts. So I'll attempt to recreate the problem that someone's having, and I see what they're saying there. So great. Thank you again all for voting. Thanks for all the questions. This is great. I will close and share that polling question. And you are correct. The VLOOKUP does make it a lot easier. It was something where when I was even working with account numbers in General Ledger and trying to do this type of analysis and coding the data in Excel, I just found it to be so difficult to do with VLOOKUP without this true statement. What is nice with the course and answering one of the questions that just came in, you will be getting the data, this data file that you're looking at, you will get. I generally get rid of this sort of junk that I did over here as part of today's work, but I do provide you all of this over here, which for the most part does exactly what we did in the course. It's just a lot neater, so I tend to send you my neat work versus the sloppy work. So you'll see here the stratification chart, all this stuff has been created for you. Okay, so let me go back into the slides just for a moment, because I do think it's useful to kind of bring up a few points from the slides, trying not to spend too much, spend more time in the broadcast, and then what you can do is the slides do kind of relate to the broadcast, so you can obviously go back to them and if you do want to print them out or have them at your desk on the side. Going into the specific accounts payable tests, we have talked about a lot of this. I'm going to show you a couple of new techniques, but starting from the bottom, well, actually, no, let me start from the top. We are going to look at the amount field and just summarize on the amount field. Now, we did Benford's Law, which was kind of a second technique that I threw in there, and I like to do it because it helps kind of explain the data a bit and how to make pivot tables kind of easily. But I like to summarize on the amount field itself, and we'll talk about a variety of techniques you could use there. And then we'll also look for round multiples of things, because I find that round dollars is something else that people like to look for. We talked about the weekends and holidays, so the weekday function handled the 1 and the 7s, and so that's that. And then summarizing day, month, year, I think we even showed how to do it by quarter. There's a lot there. I would say too, I mean, people don't have that much time for this, but I think even playing around with these pivot tables and kind of dragging fields in and out, in sort of going through all of those, just going back to a very early slide here, but kind of going through all of these query viewpoints is a very useful way of auditing and just kind of playing with all the fields. I work with someone who will take every code field that they get in accounts payable, and a lot of times you have various code fields for terms and which location sent it and all these other things, and he'll summarize on every one of them just to kind of see what comes up. And with pivot tables, you're literally just dragging the field in and out to do that. To that end, summarizing activity by user and month is also a good one, and we will talk about that as well. So let me kind of get, well, actually, yeah, we are going to talk through, just while I'm noting this, we will talk about calculating an average as well, and a maximum. So we're going to, kind of the longest time to enter a vendor invoice. So we'll talk about that as well in just a second here. So let's go back into the data. And just trying to take a look here. Okay, the best place to put this is probably right around here. So in this invoice amount field, we can right-click and insert a new field here. And basically, it's an if statement. But what we're going to do is kind of set up whether or not it is round. And I'm going to do this in more of a simple way. You're using the mod function, and we're going to divide this by 1,000 for right now. I think 1,000 is a good number. And we'll kind of copy that down. Now, to copy program, a function down, you can click Control-C or right-click it, and then you can double-click on this little button on the right bottom side of the cell. You can click on that, and it'll copy it all the way down. Now, what's noticeable here is that when you click on the round, I can go to Data Filter, and I can then click on the 0. So what that's doing, what this round function is doing, as you'll see here in a second, is it'll take each amount, divide it by 1,000, and it comes up with the difference. Let's bring them all back now. Bringing them all back, 2,657 was divided by 1,000, came up with a difference of 657.99 at the end of it. So looking further down here, one of the things that does happen when I set this to 0 is in the invoice amount section, a lot of times 0, actually, the actual 0 is a number that comes up. So it's not coming up in my data, so I don't really care, but it's something you might want to consider to kind of remove that. So you could click on the invoice amount, kind of drag down, and or you could even do number filter does not equal 0, and it does not change anything. So the number of records way down here on the left-hand side of my screen is 67 out of 4,821 are round. So this gives you kind of the round function, which a lot of people like to look for these types of payments. And what I would normally do at this point is I would do Control-Shift the 8 key, number 8, and that will highlight all of the data. I can then copy that data, and I would bring it to a new sheet, which I think I could put here. It won't let me. So I wanted to save a sheet here, but I can insert a worksheet and copy that data into here, and then that will be just the round items for the filtered items that we have. We could rename this to be round at this point, and then that would be done. Okay, just going back to the pivot table section. At this point, now that you have the round data, what I would then do is insert a pivot table on this. Now, let me just show you here. We can hit vendor number and invoice amount. And I would even bring down the count because I find the count of the invoice amount sometimes, and the way to change that, again, click on the field here, click Value Field Settings, and click on Count. And then it provides you that. Now, what I find, again, there's not a whole lot of round numbers here, but I'm just trying to show you some other techniques that are really useful. I want to look for vendors that have the most round payments, so that's the most interesting to me. So I have vendor number, sum, count. I can click on the drop-down and go More Sort Options. So if you sort A to Z, a lot of people will click Sort A to Z and it doesn't work. All I'm sorting is the vendor number, so it doesn't help. I have to go to More Sort Options and select the count field, but I want to do it in descending order. So you have to click on the count field on that bottom section, hit OK, and then in descending order you have all of your round numbers. Now imagine your data is a lot bigger and the summary is a lot bigger and you have a lot more to look at, but this gives you the idea. What's nice now though is if I want to look at the top vendor and look at those round payments, I can just double click on this and it will bring it to a new worksheet that you can take a look at. Most people do it this way, and then I tend to kind of, if I look at it, there's nothing really relevant here, I'll delete that sheet and just kind of start over. There are other ways at this point of sort of double-clicking and just kind of bringing out certain detail fields that you want. but it's I think a lot harder. So I'm going to kind of not suggest that technique, and instead just kind of keep it more more to bringing up a new sheet. But one of the things that can be useful in kind of setting this up is you might want to bring down the invoice number. If I can do this, hold on one second, and invoice date. And I know this looks kind of crazy, but you end up getting rid of the invoice number fields here. What you can end up doing is just essentially right-clicking and collapsing the entire field. And you can even come over here, right-click and say collapse the entire field. So I mean, this is a way where if you wanted to kind of look at the various fields down at more of a summary level here, where you're kind of getting for this one vendor the 4 invoices that come up, you can kind of click down further into getting the amounts. But again, I'm kind of showing you here, as much as you may want to play with this technique, I'm going to kind of Control Z out of this, and actually it won't let me go any further than that, but that's okay. And then I can just drag these fields out and get back to my vendor number summary by sorted high to low. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through a variety of techniques, even going through some of the sort orders, etc., one of the things I wanted to do is kind of go back to my payables data, probably even to this this one here. If you never know, what this actual worksheet set up to, this sheet number 2, you can always kind of click on the data itself, click on Pivot Table Tools, and click on Change Data Source. It is the right one. But I'm pretty sure this pivot sample that we had over here is also good, so I'll work with this one here because I'm pretty sure that's the right one. Okay, so what I wanted to work on now is the different types of field settings that you have, and how you can start calculating some really interesting stuff. Like we've been doing more sum and counting, which is useful, but what I hope to do is kind of take it a bit further. So I'm going to first off get rid of check date and bring in vendor number and get rid of years. So I'm going to drag that out. So I just have kind of vendor number and this amount field over here. Now I have to kind of look back into my data because I'm not completely sure if I set up this field or not. So let me just kind of go back to this data here. And what I notice here is I don't have a days payable outstanding, so we do need to calculate this field. Now this may create an interesting problem, but let's take here. I'm going to add DPO, so days payable outstanding, and I'm going to do a couple of them. So what I'll do is I'll create 2 fields very quickly. We'll have DPO, enter date, and DPO, invoice date. And what I guess I probably shouldn't even call this DPO, but we'll work off this entry date here just to take a look. What I can do is I can take the check date minus the enter date, and that comes up in this crazy format, but we'll fix that in a second. And then I'm going to take the check date for the second field and minus the invoice date. Now I need to change these field formats, so we'll go over here and we'll select them as such. And as crazy as those dates look, that they are, I believe, correct, and that's 09 and that's 010. Okay, so now that I have these 2 formulas set, I can then copy that down for the entire sequence by doing a copy and double-clicking and dragging that all the way down the chart here. Now that I have this DPO field here, I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure I can go to my pivot sample at this point. And if I right-click and click on refresh, we have to see here, yep, it does. It does add those 2 fields. I wasn't sure if it would, if it had kind of taken it in as more of a field, because I have had times where if I add things to the end of the worksheet, it won't count it. It doesn't notice it. But if you're inserting the fields as we did here, it does kind of dynamically bring those up. So now that we have that, I mean, we can have sum of invoice amount. That's fine. I'm going to click on the DPO invoice and DPO entered. But here's kind of I'm not going to sum it because that doesn't really tell me much. I'm going to right-click on those and go to Value Field Settings. And in this case, I'm going to click the average. And then on the sum of DPO, actually, I need to kind of look at which field am I looking at. Yep, the sum of DPO entered at this point, I'm going to put the maximum. So we've set up, what is the average and what's the maximum. Let me just format these fields, excuse me, just a little bit nicer because it is an average. It calculated it and did a kind of a number on the data field there. All right, there we go. So now you can kind of look at the average days payable outstanding, and you could do this for any date field. Excuse me, if you had an inventory item and wanted to look at, how many days are we away from the expiration date, or when was the last time we counted that item. There are a variety of things that you could work off of date fields. But what I wanted to show you, as we quickly talked through before, but hopefully you see it now, it really does some nice jobs of calculating things. Now if you want to get really crazy and kind of bring in the check date field, thankfully it's summarized it by month here because that was the last grouping that I had. But a lot of times it'll put the whole day in there, and that's kind of annoying. But if I click on that field, right-click it, click the group field, you notice we're in the month and year category, so that's good. And then this brings it out. Again, you can literally get an analysis by vendor and by month and year. So you could almost, I mean, this is probably hard to graph at this point because it's a lot to look at. So one of the things that you might want to do, so now that we've kind of built this out and hopefully this is making sense to you. One last thing that I want to do is take the invoice amount field, and I got to hope it's going to allow me to bring it into the filter category as well. So now that I have that in the filter category up top, it both allows me to have it in the amount field but also in the filter field. I can click on this and we can do a select multiple item scenario. Just kind of keeping this quick for us, I will get everything over, let's say $50,000 and just kind of looking at those. And then that will allow you to bring out that data just within the pivot table and using filtering. However, you may want to come up with different approaches here of filtering. Like you may want to filter not so much on amount, but on the type of vendor, who entered the item. So, again, kind of taking the enterer and putting that in here. You can now kind of look at it based on who is entering things and do it one by one if you wanted to analyze somebody's abilities or how they're entering things in and how quickly they're getting things paid. You can kind of look at it from that perspective as well. So just giving you many different things that you can do with these pivot tables. So let me just make sure we've gone through all of this section. I think we have. Yeah, just taking a look back at the invoice tests that we talked about, one of the things I didn't talk about was summarizing on the invoice amount field. And I'm going to click on this Benford amount section over here and just kind of talk you through it. All I did was I dragged the invoice amount field into the rows, so that notice how it's in the rows, and then I also have the count and the sum. And now that it's here, notice it has, I don't know if you can see this, but it has a little like sort button with a descending on it. So I already kind of set this up, but hopefully you're catching along from what we've done so far. And you can right click on that field, go more sort options, descending on account. And what this tells me is that I have $19.42 61 times. Again, Benford law I like a lot. Just going back to this other Benford chart, is it does it start with a 1? Does it start with a 2? How does it relate to Benford's law, which is something that we talked about as well? Like, is it way off for the number 2 or way off for the number 3? These are all very kind of interesting concepts. But I think kind of boiling it down to bottom line, what are the numbers that are thrown out here? And I don't know if you noticed this, but the Benford law number for 1 was really sort of high. Like we had a lot of number 1s, more so than Benford's law. We also had a lot of number 2s, more so than Benford's law. And again, just noting this, looking back at this little section down here, you'll notice I'm number one is 46% of data when it should be 30%. Number two is 24% of data when it should be 17, 18%. And therefore, the ones and the twos are very high in the data, as you can kind of notice. So, you might want to take a look at some of these just to see, is somebody playing a game with the system and putting through a lot of small dollar items? Is this an efficiency game where, maybe from an efficiency point of view, you should be, taking a look at some of these sections or some of these payments and trying to reduce them. But a lot of times I think people think more of the fraud aspect of it, so I'll kind of stick with that's usually what people are looking at. We are going to do, when we get into general ledger, kind of the summary by user and month, but let me just quickly kind of show that because I have it in my slide and I feel like I should show it to you. A real kind of easy, simple sort of way you could probably pull this off is just take the enter field and drag it into the work that we had, drag out now the vendor field, and boy, I must be filtered on DX or something, yeah, because we sure had a lot of DXs there. But this will then drive that chart, and I probably am not doing this enough justice here, but what you're able to do with this chart at least is to kind of see the sum by person and by time frame, and pretty quickly here, I mean, you can. Let me just quickly kind of go into this. If I have this right, KD has a lot in July, and then has this huge negative, in June of the next year, kind of thing. So I don't know if I'm reading it right, but it is kind of interesting to see stuff like that and say, did they put a lot in and then take it all out in the following year? Again, a bit of a fraud and way you would look at trends, but. What I find is you're usually looking for people that don't post a lot of entries, but have a material effect. So going back to that proper chart here, summary by enter and month and year, probably the best thing to do at this point is to include the count as opposed to the sum. So I'm going to change the value field setting to a count. Again, all this stuff can be done very, very quickly. And now that we have kind of the number of items that are being entered each month, what you might want to take a look for are times where a person is putting in a very, very low number into these areas. So like the count is less than 10, let's say. So we're getting to a few here. This is where the user is blank. So that's kind of interesting. And also, though, has a low number here, low volume, but a high value. So, probably what you also want to do is have the invoice amount field in there, that sum, and looking for a high value. And even, for some of these low ones, you don't really have a high value. So anyway, these are just some of the techniques people are using when looking at these graphs and just try to think of, what's something that shouldn't be happening in the data, and just trying to kind of model that in the data itself. Okay, well, I've talked a bit about the pivot table tools and all the charting and pivot table tools. And I did want to say that you have a tough time charting. Let me just get to this here. It's a really tough time to chart a scatter graph. I don't think pivot tables will even allow it to be done. So that's something that we need to kind of consider when building this. And so the scatter graph is something, though, that I really like using quite a bit. And of all the graphs out there, I think it's probably one of the better graphs going. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit here, but you can kind of notice in these slides you have kind of high dollar change with low count, low dollar change with high count, etc. Okay, so that's this slide here. Let me go back to that chart here just to explain what I'm doing. We're going to show you how to do scatter graphs and just a basic kind of value volume scatter graph. What I'm showing you here, though, is the difference between 2 years of data in volume and value format. So you're looking at now differences in vendor accounts. In this case, it could be inventory product usage, it could be customer sales, you pick whatever you'd like. But just looking at the count and volume differentials by, in this case, vendor. Now, the ones that are very low or or right here, but are in a high dollar position. So the 65 million, but low number of invoices is very interesting. Ones that have a lot of count, like 2,000 invoices and $50 million, is something that is also interesting because it's just very large and there's a lot of activity. But that's more known. I mean, that's something where I had a lot more activity with a vendor. We paid them a lot more. That makes sense. The ones that are kind of close to the line, like that 65 million, it doesn't make as much sense because it's something where there's a low volume associated with it. The ones that sort of like really don't make sense is this one over on the left-hand side. So you have 1,500 more items, but the actual value is decreasing by 25 million. So we have less activity and more invoices, and probably I remember that one person KD had like a lot of negative and a lot of positive. Probably that has something to do with this particular vendor because they have a lot of credit balance there that's just really throwing it off. Anyway, just wanted to show you kind of four quadrants and within the quadrants how you can kind of look at each quadrant a little bit differently, and definitely keep that thought in mind. The main thought in mind, though, that it's hard to read in the graph here because it's in italics, but 36 vendors out of the 5,800 vendors, I think we have like 5,800 in the data, basically are being represented in this chart. So, all of them are really in this small pocket in the middle here. There's not a whole lot, of activity, that's happening kind of outside of that pocket. All right, well, let's kind of go to the next polling question. I do see a lot of questions coming in, so I want to kind of get to those as well. And that is, what value field setting is used to obtain the largest item in a pivot table? Min, over, more, or max? So we'll give everybody a few seconds there to answer that question. Okay, and many of you have voted, so thank you. Just going back, I think I did miss a question before that I should have gotten to, and I'll kind of set up my my data for it. There's a question in here about pivot charting and changing to rows and columns, so hopefully I can answer that. Just bear with me, folks. Okay, and how do I VLOOKUP for credit scores to group numerical ranges into, to group the numerical ranges into alphabetical groups? The way to do that is to use the second option of stratification that we just talked about a little while ago, and you want to do kind of a VLOOKUP where you want to put the starting point of that account range as kind of, so I think what I'll do is I'll try to show an example of that as well, because I actually like to kind of talk that one through a little bit on that stratification and VLOOKUP. So let me try to model something there for you as well. And okay, so one question is, how can we reformat the date when it's been submitted in a certain way and you want it to be kind of reformatted in another way, and format cells does not work? I will kind of show you an approach there. We're going to use, I believe, active data for that one. So I think most of you have voted. I'm trying my best here to set up some examples here as we go, but let me try to close this and share the poll just to get this out of the way. And 96%, 91% of you are correct. It is the max format. So let me hide my screen. Okay, great. And we're back. So, with the account numbers that we just talked about before, how would we do this? My understanding is you'd want to kind of set it up in more of a numerical type format. So it would have to be kind of like 1,000 versus like 0, 0, 0, 0, 1,000. It can't kind of be like a text field is my understanding. It has to be an amount field. But with that said, let's say you had in this case we wanted to go from 0 to 1,000. What we would do in this case is we would put kind of the 0 there, and we would say up to 1,000, and then the 1,000 would be kind of set up as the next mark, and then you would put like up to 2,000, and instead of putting up to 2,000 as your kind of naming convention, you'd probably want like an A or a B, and then this would be 2,000 would be set there as well. And I'm not I don't want to keep going with it too far here, but you can kind of get the idea of how that would be lined up. In the VLOOKUP, I mean, you could do this just to kind of keep it straight in your mind, I guess, but probably all you'd need to do actually is just put that there and delete that. So you can really just have this is a way of kind of setting up a VLOOKUP range, but it's going to be more in a true sort of format. What I'll do is I'll leave that in there, when we save the data. One question came in around date ranges, and then we'll get to this pivot chart question. Okay, so this is kind of set up as 24 MAR 09. So I set this up as a general right now. Generally, if you go to short date, it will change it for you. Now, what I guess can happen, let me just kind of bring this over to the right. This was a question, how do you change kind of the format when it won't change? Let me kind of bring that over here. What can happen is in your data, I don't know if this will even look right. Yeah, I'm not sure that'll look right, but you can have this kind of set up in a way where you have, for the most part, say like 27-MAR-09, and it's more of a text field at this point. It's not really a date, and I think actually I don't know if I set this to date, see, it won't work, right? It doesn't come in as a date. Only thing I could think of, I use this product Active Data for this, and you go to cells, convert selected cells, and you can go cells to date, and it will, it kind of asks you some questions, and it kind of asks you what format and the separator, and you could put that in there. But that has an ability to kind of fix things like that, so if that helps. So I did want to present those two options. Active Data is something you got to buy. We do have a discounted link we could send you if you want it. Just email me. But with that said, it's something to buy. They do have a 30-day license, and I'll try to show something with what they have today as well if we can fit it in. But I did give you a quick little demo there, I suppose. Okay, getting back to the actual one question of the pivot chart and kind of changing rows and columns. I don't know if I can replicate the problem in here because that happens, but if okay, so this is rows and columns. That actually looks even better, now that I look at it. But sometimes it won't allow you, and generally speaking, it won't allow you because there's too much data in here, and it won't allow it to kind of go out for that many days. So if I, attempt kind of, getting this, sorry, I'm not sure if I can replicate it right now. But when we go to select rows and columns, yeah, it just unfortunately is working too well. But what I find though is what you can do is if you have too many columns in there, what you can do is summarize it like we've done here, and that will usually do it. But almost all times that I've ever had a row to column scenario problem, it's because the field, there's too many columns that it's going to create, and hence it has a problem with that. So let me save that work, but get rid of that worksheet, and we will get into the scatter graph sample. So what I wanted to do is just go back to that scatter graph technique and open up and show you this. Now, because the scatter graph is something that you can't really get out of, out of the data itself from a pivot table and just pivot table it, what you tend to have to do is do that copy and paste that we talked about, the Control-Shift number 8, and that'll allow you to kind of line that up properly. And with that done, what I like to do is kind of set up an amount year and account year 1 and amount year and account year 2. So what you're going to do is kind of copy the data out of the pivot chart or pivot table so that you can get sort of those 2 years worth of amounts. Over in here I have the supplier number, so this would have been probably, if this was coming out of a pivot table, that's how it would have looked. What I then do over here is I'm looking at the differential. So I take the two amounts, amount year 2 minus amount, amount year 1, in this case minus amount year 2. Amount year 1 is the more current year, amount year 2 is the prior year, and we continue down. Also do the same for count year 1 versus year 2. So what is the new data versus the old data in volume and value. So we have both of those. This is what I end up pivot charting on. So I end up kind of, scatter graphing on, not pivot charting. I highlight that data. I go to Insert, Scatter Graph, and hit the Scatter Graph button. And then that produces the scatter graph, and you can see how it has kind of a negative and positive volume and value section to it. Okay. Let me go over to this one here. So I basically created two different versions of this chart. I created this one here where you have kind of amount 1 and amount 2, and you basically have kind of the count of year 1, count and volume, count and value of year 1 and count and value of year 2, and they're plotted as red and blue depending on which one is which. That's one option, and it's not a bad option. It's just I don't know if you really kind of get the differential in vendors, because each vendor on this, basically every dot here is a vendor, and it's hard to differentiate which vendor is which. In the scatter difference, what we've done here, we've taken that same data and we've aligned it using that volume and value setup that we talked about. And in this case, I think it's just a lot cleaner, the way it presents itself, and it throws all the differences out accordingly. So, as to the various types of charts that you can create, and I tend to use the pivot charting a lot more these days because I find it creates a more dynamic way of looking at your data. If you end up dropping new data into the pivot data section, so basically if you kind of drop new data into the scatter graph section over here, way up here, if you kind of drop the data in here, it'll automatically kind of pivot table off of that and create a pivot chart accordingly. The problem is you can't do that for the scatter graph, so that's why we're kind of doing this in more of a manual fashion, and why I wanted to show you a couple of different scatter graphs so you can kind of get an idea. Okay, so that is the scatter example. Sure. And what I wanted to now do is jump into general ledger tests. So one of the things I wanted to show you today is setting up a entries by day analysis. So this is kind of a new one for me, but it's something that I find really interesting to kind of look at the variety. But we'll talk about this in a second. It's just kind of giving you an idea, though, of the number of journal entries that are being posted by day, so that you can get an idea of kind of that number. And this is a scatter graph, but again, we kind of have to get the data out of the pivot table to do this. And what I wanted to now do is kind of walk through a variety of general ledger tests. Now, everything is probably noting to you, it's probably looking the same a bit. A lot of the tests are kind of the same. And for the most part, you'll see that pivot tabling does that. It's something where you can work in accounts payable, general ledger, what have you, and it all kind of uses a bit of the same techniques. So we'll kind of walk through those for examples and kind of showing you the enter a month section here, but let's hold off on the polling question. These will be the slides that we're now going to go through in more of a detailed way in this general ledger sample data. Okay, and okay, so what we've done here is I tried to take the techniques that we talked about earlier, and I wanted to do a little bit more with them. And in a lot of ways, again, this stuff will all be set up for you so that you can just refer back to the completed example if it helps you to kind of drill back into how did we build this thing in the first place. But for the most part, what I did here was, notice here, we have this kind of crazy if statement now. Instead of it being a setup here where we're using just the mod function, in this case I just wanted to show you this quickly, that you can use kind of an if and function, and this is saying, well, if the amount isn't zero, is it basically divisible by 100 and it doesn't equal 0, then you can put round. If not, you put not round. So this is again a one step forward on the technique that we just talked about before with the mod, and I wanted to give you that so you have that. And now we can kind of highlight round, and these are all of the round transaction items. So this is at the transactional level. This is a general ledger file. We have journal entry 1, 2 accounts. These are the amounts being posted to. This is a little field here, not round, round. And then we have, obviously date and who entered the item. One of the things that everyone likes to do, it's a good thing to do, is to summarize everything by journal entry number. And again, what I've done here, just interest of time, just to kind of show you the technique, we summarized in the row of a journal entry number. We're accumulating the debits and credits over here. And one thing that you could do, I'm pretty sure at this point, and quite frankly, I don't do it as much because I tend to still do my Control-Shift number 8. But in an attempt to show you, kind of a better way, you can select the Pivot Table Tools section when you're in here and go to Fields and go to Calculated Field. And my problem is I don't know when you go kind of debit minus credit. What we'll do here is we'll say debit amount minus credit amount. We'll call it difference. I get a little confused if it's working more off the summary or the or not, but I guess in a lot of ways, I guess it doesn't matter, So if it's summarizing on the debits and credits and then doing a difference, it works. So yeah, no, this is a better way. You can notice here there's even a 2-cent difference, and boom, it notes it. But this is a great way to then filter on this field. So you could take a look at all of the items that are now different. What you could do is kind of come over here and go to value filter, but I would go to more sort options in this case and maybe sort on the difference itself and just kind of give you an idea of where all the differences are by journal entry number. As you can see, the differences are very slight, showing up at the bottom and the top of the pivot table, and they're within pennies, so it's really not that big of a deal. But again, a way of kind of getting to that analysis. The next one, let me just bear with me 1 minute here. Okay, so what I okay. All right, hopefully I'm back. Yep, okay, great. Sorry about that, folks. My microphone just cut out for some reason, so sorry. And just came up and said, do you want to use new hardware? And I said no, thinking that was the right answer, but I should have clicked yes. Sorry about that. Okay. What I wanted to show you here is that we had the journal entry summary, as we had it before, and we have kind of the summaries of differences, etc. Let me go back to the raw general ledger data. Let me take off that filter, and I'm going to insert a pivot table off of that raw GL data, and I'm going to do it on the date, so the date field. I don't want it grouped in this case, and what we'll then do is bring in the debit amount, and I'm just going to bring in the count of the debit amount, but I'm going to get rid of that grouping in a second here. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I had a daily analysis here, so kind of like a daily summary of how many journal entries and the value of those journal entries per time frame. And what I then did was I copied and pasted that into my daily sum sheet over here. So you can kind of see where I kind of cut and pasted that. With that done, I then created the daily sum chart, which is just a summary, but now it's a scatter graph. So again, like we said before, we can't do scatter graphs in the pivot tables, but here we go. The reason I like to look at this, and you know, the value here are all positives. Some things, well, let me just explain this to you first. Each one of these is a day, and for each day, you can kind of see how many journal entries were entered. Now, the key here, let me just get rid of this graphing. This is a really, I think, a great technique in the format of the axis. So notice that axis is like 110, 100, and 1,000. In formatting the axis, there are probably many ways to do this. I right-click on the axis, but probably if you go up to Chart Tools, there is a way to kind of add a chart element, you know, and go to More Axis Options and all that. But anyway, I like to right-click and go Format Axis. Within here, you have a logarithmic scale or not. Now, take a look at this graph. This is basically number of entries per day and value. So you can kind of get a sense of, you know, where some of the large value with not a lot of entries were happening. This is kind of interesting even where you have very low volume but yet a pretty high value. But then let me kind of change that axis and go to a logarithmic scale. The reason I like the logarithmic scale is it presents items in more of that 1, 10, 100, 1,000. You could do fives, parts of 5 if you'd like. But what I'm looking for in this is that, you know, there are certain days of the year, probably year-end, month-end, where they have lots of activity, and that's kind of in this 100 to 1,000 range. The ones where you have, say, 10 to 100 in activity are more, I guess, you know, standard kind of days of the month or such, but they're not like a month-end. And you can look for some ones that obviously have high values. The ones that I really like to look at are where you normally have no activity, but yet a high value. So, I mean, even these couple here, if you can I'll kind of scroll into them, you know, these two items here, point number 10 and point number 16, you know, these are great to take a look at. Now, what I have a tough time figuring out and doing is being able to kind of take that point number 10, going back to the daily summary, and you know, finding the actual day, you know, a lot of times. So you end up having to kind of look at, you know, the summary based on the value and the volume that's in there, and kind of saying, okay, it's 16, but it's like $21 million, and you know, then you go back into the data and find it, because I've never been able to get the scatter graph to include this as as basically a data label for each one of those items on the chart. But I did show this chart because I think, you know, in a kind of graphical pivot table kind of way of looking at data, not only General Ledger is a great one for this because it's very standard what accounting does all the time in certain parts of the month, but I think even inventory, revenue, accounts payable, these are all areas that, you know, I think that this chart works really well with. And we talked about the net to zero item, so I did that. And, you know, another thing we summarized by enterer here and day over here. Now, that's going to drive this chart to look crazy, so that looks a bit crazy. So you need to kind of go in here and group that day by month and year, or quarter year, you know, is probably be good too. And then going back to my enterer chart, it is a nicer sort of chart to look at. Now, the 3D rotation is something that you can change as well, and generally speaking, I can right-click on the chart and upon doing so select 3D rotation. Now, I tend to kind of play around with these. I think it's more of a, you know, what looks better versus getting the right, you know, percentage down of what, you know, is it 60% or 90%. I tend to kind of play with it until it looks right. Yeah, anyway, it's right-clicking on these 3D graphs and saying check or set up a 3D rotation to get that going. Okay, we are pretty much through the general ledger section. Let me just make sure. I think we've covered everything there. So what I want to do is go to this next polling question, and then we'll basically close the day answering any questions, but talking about the dynamic nature of pivot tables and how we can kind of set up a dynamic pivot table. But okay, with that said, what function is used to determine a round number? So what function is used to determine a round number? Is it the offset, the mod, the mid, or the round? And I will start looking at the questions if you want to take a few seconds to start answering that. Thank you. Okay, just taking a look at some of the questions here. Downloading the PowerPoint presentation. I know we did send it out to everyone. Just taking a look here. Right, so the PowerPoint presentation and the data tables will be kind of sent out at the same time as the link. The webinar recording, give us a few days. I try to get it out there and email everybody within a few days. But I will say, technically speaking, it should be about 3 to 5 days. You should expect it. So I would say early next week would be the best. In taking a look, a lot of the points were on my volume turned off. Sorry about that. There is a question in here I probably will have to get back to you on this. Is you developed a field within Excel that's more of a lookup table or lookup field that will kind of look up a cell value, and each drop-down menu has various items to choose, and you can select that. Probably the best way to do it, it may work, minus those group fields, but probably, unfortunately, the best way to do it is to kind of copy and paste that into a new sheet and, change those fields or delete those fields. I did see the question in there on the scatter graph where people, had asked, how do I identify which vendor it represents? And, to be honest, I'll take these two down to kind of ask my Excel experts, the people that train me in a way, to ask about this, because I agree with you. I think the scatter graph, like having the vendor number show up, would be so great, but I've never been able to figure out how to do it. I've tried all these different ways and just never been able to get the vendor number into the scatter graph. I have to work off of the XY axis and find it, and it works, but it's so much better just to have a vendor name or vendor number pop up when you highlight it. So I will ask those questions. I'll try in this email even that we send out with the data files to answer the the couple that I'm not answering too well. But I do think that lookup field probably is going to be best to be data be copied and pasted into a new sheet and kind of start with that. Start with the new sheet. Okay. So looking down my questions, I think that is everything. And again, feel free to post them if not. And share those with you. And yeah, most people select the round item because, round. But round is basically setting up how round do you want it. Do you want it rounded to 4 digits, 2 digits, 3 digits? That's the round function. Whereas the mod function will divide. It's like a divisor, and it's going to divide it by whatever you're set at, 1,000, 100, whatever, and come up with that differential. So let me hide that screen. And I'm going to go now into my slides, actually. Just bear with me here. and talking about building dynamic ranges for pivot tables as well as for actually even graphs themselves. Okay, the first thing I would say is I don't study this very well. Like I always kind of copy this actual formula, so we're going to do this in a second. But what I find is that this formula uses the offset feature, and what it's going to do is it's going to look at whatever schedule or tab in Excel that you're working with. So if you have, let's say the payables data, we would have payables data replacing that pivot data section there. And then you have A1, comma 0, comma 0, comma count A, et cetera, et cetera. But the only place that you're changing really in this formula is the payables data section. What that'll do then, and I say don't study it, copy it in this case. What that'll do is it sets up an offset section where it's going to kind of start at A1, and it's going to kind of count over and then count downward all of the columns and rows so that it's dynamic. So what's really nice about that is, as we'll show you, if you have a schedule like payables data, you can throw all of your data into that and then have the pivot table work its magic, this named range, work its magic, and essentially build the pivot table for you dynamically. Now next month, let's say you get another 20,000 transactions that you put into this data table. It will automatically calculate to whatever data is in there and then will work. But really all it is a named range called that, and we're going to walk you through this. The other one that's a little bit harder to do, and I'm trying to even show it to you in here because it's funny. Sometimes I kind of goof up when copying and pasting this one. This is like the hardest thing to do in my day for this presentation, and that's kind of getting the dynamic ranges for graphs. So for this one, what you want to do is set it up where you're kind of starting more or less where the data is. So it's starting at G2. It's using this offset feature, and it's G2 in this case. And in this particular case as well, it then has this -1 at the end, and what that's doing is kind of calculating the header column at that point. But it's very cryptic how it works. But again, copy this stuff. I think this is something where I haven't spent the time to really dissect these two formulas. All I know is I've been using them for years and got them from an Excel, Mr. Excel himself, Bill Jelen. This is something that's really worked quite well. The main function, though, that we're using in both of these cases is the offset function and the count A function. So just to kind of boil it down here, it's just those two functions that are being used. So, you could research more on that as well. What I'm going to do is kind of dive into the data now and try to replicate this, and just bear with me 1 minute here. I'm going to try to open up this general ledger data that we just had before, and we have this file or table called raw GL data. Now what I do, I thought I had that open, is I like to work in a text pad editor. This is EditPad Pro. It costs a little bit of money, like $50 or something, but I find it's a little bit better than some of the free ones out there. Definitely better than Notepad. But whenever I'm doing formulas, I tend to kind of work in here. What it does is it kind of strips out all of the nasty formatting that can kind of come in normal data, such as Word data or Excel data. So what I can do is I can highlight. If you can see this, I highlighted that slide, and I'm copying that data into my text editor. So that's a good old copy. And while I'm here, I'm just going to go down to that other one and copy and paste that data as well. And okay, so now I'll get rid of my slideshow. Don't need that anymore. And now taking a look in my data to this formula, down below here, have the raw GL data. I can right-click and say rename and copy that data, and I can copy that into every place, that had pivot data, or in this case it's sheet 1, and you can notice here, ooh, this is not good. It ended up kind of putting in like a space in there, which we don't want, and then even with the formatting, I apologize, it seems to have, edited the formatting a bit. You may want to retype just, kind of like the one quote here and a space, but it's funny how these things tend to kind of make Excel go crazy, but it's really nothing you're doing. Okay, now that I have this formula set, though, and I have it set to raw GL data, I can then copy that, and this is sort of the somewhat hard part. You go into formulas, so you go into formulas. Bear with me, sorry about this. You just go into formulas, go into name manager, so formulas name manager. I think I already maybe have set one up in here, but I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this pivot data all, something like that. And I really should probably call it GL data all. So maybe I'll call it, GL pivot. There we go. Now, and when in the refers to, I wouldn't go right click, I wouldn't put my right cell, I wouldn't do anything but really just a Control V, where you can right click and paste what we just had before. So you're just kind of copying and pasting that into there. And it's called GL pivot. Its scope is the entire workbook, and we hit OK. And now it created that GL pivot named range. It's called this nasty thing down here, and that is equivalent to what was in our EditPad Pro. Okay, now that I have that, very simply, whenever I want to create a pivot table, I have to remember the name of it, but I believe it was called Pivot GL. Of course, I came up with the wrong one, so I got to go back to my formulas, name manager, GL pivot. Okay, GL pivot. Go to Insert Pivot Table, GL Pivot. And now that I've done this, it's basically asking for select a table or range. Normally you would have highlighted that whole thing. I then do GL Pivot. That's it. And I could enter, let's say we create a little pivot table here for each entrer in the total or something like that, just kind of quickly showing you that. Now, let's just say, let me do this. Let me kind of quickly show you here that in count form, just to sort of prove this to you, in count form we have 19,964 rows. So if I go to the bottom of my data, I have 19,964 data rows in my data. So if I add now a lot of data to this, or just maybe add like 5,000 or so rows, so I'm really kind of messing up the data, but just having a little bit of fun. We kind of add that to the bottom. When I go back to my pivot table, I have 19,964, okay, but if I go to Pivot Table Tools and click Refresh, or I can right-click and click Refresh, we now have 2903 because it automatically, dynamically figured that out. If I add columns to this, or for that matter, really what can happen here is you can even start using this across different locations. So if location 1 gives you data looking like this, but then location 2 gives you data that looks totally different, it really doesn't matter. It starts to dynamically just calculate what it needs to do in each one of those sections. Okay, so that's kind of step 1, dynamic named range and getting the pivot table set. The second one that I wanted to show you here, and I just maybe in the interest of time here, go to the name manager, let's click on that test. Okay, so this one is looking at the raw GL data. It's looking at column C2. So C2 is what's being looked at here. And this other stuff down here of the A and the A, don't touch that because it's more or less kind of calculating things. But the C2 is what you want to focus in on of that. So I go to raw GL data, I go to C2, and in this particular case, that is basically the debit amount column in this case. So so we're kind of starting there, and then what it's going to do is kind of calculate from there a dynamic range for a chart. Now, so what you do here in this particular case is go back to my named manager. We have test as that field in there. So what I can do is, just trying to think of a quick way to show this to you. I think bear with me 1 second here. Okay, yeah, what I can do, all right, well, I will set up my own. What we can do is more or less just chart on this one field and maybe do kind of a debits to credits or something like that. I just, in looking at this particular table, it's maybe not the best here, but when I highlight just these two columns, I can go insert and go, a scatter graph in this case, and that creates that scatter graph. Let me kind of move that to its own chart for a second here. And now that it's moved here, what you can do is you can select the data, and this is a little cryptic, but what you can do is you can highlight that range, C2 to C20904, which is the end of the data, and you can enter in the word test. And what that does, it's kind of odd. It enters in this name of the Excel file, which is weird, but it ends up basically making a dynamic range of that amount. Now, similarly, as this data grows and gets smaller, that column C, as long as column C has the amount in it, it will essentially dynamically work off of that field. So just want to get to the last polling question now that we've kind of gotten through everything, and answer, this is a good time if you want to post any final questions. We're sort of closing out this session towards the end here. But this last polling question is, what function allows you to grab all of the data for a pivot table which can be updated dynamically? Is it VLOOKUP? Is it offset? Is it SUMIF? Or is it replace? And so far, no new questions coming in, but feel free to post any questions as they come in. Happy to answer those. We have our obvious closing remarks at the end here to go through, but do appreciate you coming today and answer all the polls that you can, just so that we can get you the CPE credits. Okay, I'll kind of keep this poll open just for a little bit more here, just to allow you to answer. I think we should have noted this. You don't have to be right on the polling questions either. It's more or less just being here. So just noting that as well. And I'll just keep that open for another 30 seconds or so, and I'll check the questions as we're going here. Okay. I'll just keep this open another 10 seconds for last-minute voters, if you don't mind. And we'll close that poll and share it with everybody. The answer, 80% got it right, was offset, and some of the others, VLOOKUP could be useful, I suppose, but offset is something that's being used to kind of calculate dynamically the range. The presentation is included, I believe, either in the reminder email or in a separate handouts email that Jim had sent along. We will be putting that in the files that will be uploaded in 3 to 5 days. And I have a couple of questions here that I couldn't answer, but I'm curious as well, because I agree. I'm baffled by some of how Excel works, and setting up formats and labels for things is very useful. So we had a couple of questions there. So a question just coming in now. When you overlay data from another source, maybe more or less copying and pasting, why doesn't the pivot table update itself? Well, One reason might be you're not refreshing it, so you can right-click the pivot table, refresh, but if that doesn't work, usually that will work. If you change the data itself, it will go into the data and update it. So I would definitely right-click your pivot table, click refresh, or go to the toolbar and hit refresh. If not, so refresh does not work with you on this one, I would use the offset. The offset will be auto-calculating every time, and it's something kind of cool in a way where the way the formula works is sort of like every time you refresh, it sort of throws out the values it had before and refreshes it. So yeah, I mean, in essence, it should be refreshing. So one question I'm getting about Topcats and is it effective for internal auditing? I think it's a great tool. Yes, I actually one thing I wanted to show you, and while for those that are still on the line, I just find this really kind of cool. This is Active Data. I don't have Topcats installed right now, but it's relatively similar. Like it has a lot of the same functionality. Topcats, though, does have some other functionality where you can kind of calculate or more or less it almost like produces work papers for you based on your payables data, based on your revenue data. So it's kind of cool in that way. Okay, let me just quickly summarize this, though, by journal entry numbers. Might not be the best example, but I just want to give you some idea. You can include statistics, and I've included a few here. What I really liked about it, even though pivot tables will do a pretty good job of like min and max and average and all that stuff, what I thought was kind of cool. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. I really should have hid that poll. I apologize about that. Sorry about that, folks. Anyway, I'd been in Active Data. I went to the Summarize Pivot. It's kind of like a pivot table, but I included statistics in that pivot table, so I clicked the Include Statistics button, and in doing so, it produced this output. And what I like about it is it'll calculate standard deviation and other statistics and just put it to you there. And then, yeah, if you click on, I believe you click on one of these items, it actually drills down into the data just like a pivot table. So it kind of gives you that similar functionality of the pivot table, but kind of in an Excel file. So thank you. Yeah, but I think just to kind of close out the session here, just in the queue, feel free to post any other questions. But just in the queue coming up here, we'll be talking about continuous monitoring in ACL, sampling in Excel, and simple add-in products, which I definitely want to talk about Active Data, and we'll try to even get Topcats into that if I can fit it in there. And then something that I've been working on a lot these days is financial statement analysis and doing journal entry reviews. So kind of taking, the general ledger pivot table stuff that we did today and going much further into, journal entry type reviews. One thing I did mention in today's session and do want to keep mentioning is Audit Software Videos is out there. It has a lot of data and well, the data files are kind of separate on this one, but the videos are free, and we have about 70 hours of training that you can take over and over again as you like. You do have to sign up for it. The data files for this one do cost money, but it's not a lot. But it's something where I find even just watching the videos gets you through a lot and can answer a lot of questions for you. What I like about it, it's all audit focused, so all the videos, even though we talk about Excel, it's more in this kind of audit, with audit in mind the whole time. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm just going to kind of leave it at the thank you screen here for now, and really do appreciate everyone coming out today. I know we had a lot of people signed up and here today, so we do appreciate that. And I don't know, Jim, if you're out there, but if you have any final closing remarks, thanks again.
I am here, Rich, and I want to thank you for today's webinar. I think you provided a lot of great information, and I'm sure that everybody will appreciate the files that they get along with this training, as well as the videos. There were questions about the handouts. We did send the handouts to most of you this morning. Some of the people may not have gotten them because they registered late. Others, the email with the attachment may be in their spam mail. we have no control over spam filters, so that's where you might want to check and see if it's in there. And it's the same thing for the CPE certificates as well as the links. You need to make sure that you can receive the emails from both Rich Lanza as well as from Citrix, which is GoToWebinar. If there are restrictions on your email that block these domains, then you may not get the emails, and you'll need to check with your IT folks or your email administrator. So I think the next slide provides some information about the upcoming webinars, Rich. That's in there as well, in the queue, right? Okay, so we do have another ACL webinar coming up on July the 2nd, and then those of you that have signed up for more than one, there's another Excel webinar on August the 13th and another one on October the 7th. Just a reminder that you need you must register for each one. There's a link that we sent to everyone. If you didn't receive that link, just send me an email and we can send you the link to the other webinars. Rich? Are you muted, Rich?
Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, my microphone seems. I have a wonderful microphone. It costs me all this money, but it seems to be resetting itself. So I apologize about that. Hey, Jim. Yeah, no, thanks again, everyone, for coming today. I do appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you all, and have a great day, and we look forward to your joining us again in the future. And if you have any additional questions, you can reach either Rich or myself via the contact information. So please have a great day. Bye.